Today, military tech is going to expose the lies. First up, I'm at Wikipedia, military satellites. The first military satellites were photographic reconnaissance missions. Some attempts were made to develop satellite-based weapons, but this work was halted in 1967, following various treaties, okay? Different types of military satellite. Military reconnaissance satellite. Navigation, which of course we know as GPS. Early warning, satellite weapons, which of course don't exist because of the treaty, but I'll go there in another video, and military communication satellites. So all I'm interested in here is reconnaissance, early warning, and military communication satellites, okay? Bear with me. And this is what gives it away for me. The United States Air Force's dependence on these old planes. First up, we got the E-8 Joint Stars, which is an attack radar system and battle management system. Came into play in the early 90s and is on the airframe of an old 707, which essentially is a 1950s jet. So in the early 90s, their upgraded system, the E-8 Joint Stars, was a combination of a 1950s plane with more modern battle management stuff. You would have thought by the 90s you'd be looking at fading out 1950s aeroplanes and replacing it with a satellite system in space. But no, they've gone the other way. They're investing in old planes and upgrading the system within that old plane. Makes no sense whatsoever, unless of course there is no space in the first place, in the sense we're being told. Very strange. And it only gets worse. Now up, we've got the Boeing E-3 Sentry. Quite an iconic aircraft. But again, it's an old 707 airframe, which essentially is a 1950s jet that got upgraded in the 70s. Again, in the 70s with all the space race, the satellites, all that Cold War pantomime going on, you would have thought you'd have a system in space by then. Or you'd certainly be implementing it. Now, what plane did this replace? This replaced this old bear, the E2 EC-121 Warning Star. You would have thought this thing has been flying since the 50s. So the Sentry replaced that. And that was doing the job before satellites existed. So you would have thought by now the Sentry would have been faded out and satellites would be doing the job. But no, the E3 Sentry, which essentially is an old 707, upgraded in the 70s, is still going strong and is just as important to the airborne early warning system of the United States Army and Air Force now as it was before supposed satellites. Again, giving the game away. And then we've got the old RC-135, reconnaissance aircraft, still active now and has been in service since 1961. This plane is developed from a C-135 Stratolifter, which has got an interesting history in itself I've been looking at. But again, that's for another video. But primary users of this 1960s aircraft, which is still active now, the United States Air Force and the Royal Air Force. Lads, I would have thought you might have upgraded your system, particularly given the fact that people who make these planes and do the upgrades are the people who supposedly put men in space, got man to the moon. So you've developed the tech since these planes have been around to get man to the moon. But you haven't upgraded the planes that defend your very military might. It's a little bit obvious at this point in time, lads. The moon landing's comedy gold. The fact you're still dependent on these old aeroplanes as your early warning defense system, your battle management system, your attack radar system, your reconnaissance system is kind of obvious and proves there's no satellites going around the ball. We know that anyway, it's scientifically impossible. But the United States Air Force's dependence on these old planes is just a dead giveaway at this point in time. And then we come to this cracking bit of kit, pretty modern, the RQ-4 Global Hawk, which can act as a satellite, relay satellite where you can actually control one of these drones many thousands of miles away via a relay link through other drones, RQ-4 drones, which is very clever. Plus it can act like a spy drone, having the same optical payloads that U-2 spy plane has a surface ceiling height of 60,000+ feet, and is a pretty badass bit of kit. It's a long endurance, high altitude spy drone stroke communication satellite. Very good bit of kit. Started being phased in the late 90s to the US military. Of course, primary users, United States Air Force, NASA and NATO. Those primary users alone are incredibly revealing. But what I find quite interesting are the timelines. The RQ-4 started getting phased in for the US military in the late 90s. And then at the same period of time, just before and during, we've got the Mealstar satellite program, which essentially is supposed communication satellites for the US military, Air Force and Army. Of course, we've got cartoon depictions, but the RQ-4 drone will be doing the job that these things are supposedly doing. You wouldn't have brought in all these new drones if you'd put in this satellite constellation giving you worldwide communications. The timelines just expose it. The Mealstar satellite, supposed constellation communication for the US Army, Air Force, is simply the RQ-4 drone. And as I previously highlighted, this old girl, the old dragon lady, would be long retired now. It was supposed to be retired in the 60s. But still is just as important now and getting multiple upgrades. And bearing in mind, this plane came into service in the 50s. Supposedly replaced by satellites, supposedly replaced by the SR-71, still just as important now. So important that Russia have got their own equivalent of U-2 planes. This is your big boss satellite. This is the highest satellite that is manned. Higher than the drones. You do get satellites on balloons, but this is the big boss, whether it be battle management, relaying of signals, supposed weather, whatever. This does the lot. But ultimately, the US Air Force and military's dependence on these old planes. Bearing in mind, these old planes are managed by the people who supposedly put rockets in space and provide space satellites. They've had the tech to put man on the moon since these old planes have been in service, but they haven't had the tech to upgrade and improve their planes, or in fact retire them so we can rely on a space-based system. Kind of obvious at this point in time. The fact the space people are still dependent, and the US Army are still dependent on these old planes for their battle management, their attack radar, their communications, as they were before supposed satellites, thus giving the game away. There are no satellites, as in machines, craft, go around a ball. That's why it's always depicted in cartoon form, because it's fantasy. Military tech tells you so. It's that simple.